often live our lives assuming the comfort of routine. Wake up, get dressed, go to work or school, maybe run some errands, laugh with friends, share a meal with family, fall into bed, and do it all again. It's predictable, monotonous, even boring sometimes, but this cycle can be comforting until the day it breaks. The truth is, it only takes a second for everything to fall apart. A single moment can shatter a life into 1,000 pieces, leaving behind only confusion, pain, and memories of what used to be. That's what happened to the Barry family on an ordinary November night that started with warm food and laughter and ended in bloodshed, sirens, and a haunting silence no one would ever forget. James Barry was just 21 years old, young, thoughtful, and gentle-hearted when his life was stolen in a brutal act that seemed to defy logic. The horror of what happened that night wasn't rooted in a mysterious stranger or a random break-in. It came from a much darker place, a place far too familiar. The person who took James's life wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. Instead, the attack was fueled by something heartbreakingly human: unhealed emotional pain, suffocating obsession, and the sharp sting of rejection. James's story is a painful reminder that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who hurt us the deepest. In a world where we're taught to give people second chances and believe the best in those we love, it's easy to ignore the red flags until it's too late. James's murder wasn't the result of a single argument or a sudden burst of anger. It was the climax of a relationship that had slowly eroded boundaries, drained his spirit, and placed him in the path of someone who would rather see him dead than without her. This case forces us to confront an ugly truth. Love, when poisoned by control and desperation, can turn deadly. And when that shift happens, the fallout isn't just tragic, it's devastating. The Barry family had no idea that their peaceful evening would descend into horror. But in just one moment, everything changed, and they would never be the same again. James Nicholas Barry was born on May 28, 1995, in the warm and peaceful town of Wellington, Florida. To his parents, Nicola and James Barry Sr., he was not just a child, but a miracle. Soft-spoken, gentle, and remarkably kind from the very start. James wasn't the loudest kid in the room, nor the most outgoing. In fact, he often preferred the calm quiet of home to the hustle and noise of social circles. But what he may have lacked in extroversion, he made up for in compassion and sweetness. His older sister, Alexandra, often said that James had a heart just too soft for this world. The two shared a bond that defied time and distance, a sibling connection forged through laughter, shared secrets, and a shared love for animals. And animals were everywhere in the Barry household. The family had 5 dogs, 5 cats, and 5 horses, an unconventional zoo of love. James thrived in this environment, spending hours tending to the horses, playing fetch with the dogs, or curled up on the couch with a purring cat resting in his lap. He was never one for mischief, never the kind to pick fights or act out. Instead, his world was one of empathy and loyalty, especially to those closest to him. Childhood was filled with catching tadpoles, racing through fields with his best friend, and quiet evenings under the stars. His was a life of peace, of simple joys, and of innocent dreams. But that peaceful world was shaken in 2002 when James was only 7. His parents, once the foundation of his world, decided to separate. The split, like most divorces, wasn't easy, especially on the children. And in one of the most heartbreaking decisions a parent can ever ask of their kids, Nicola and James Sr. made young James and Alexandra choose which parent they wanted to live with. It was an impossible ask, a decision no child should ever be burdened with. James, still a boy, chose to stay with his mother, while Alexandra went with their father. Just like that, the Barry household was divided. One child with each parent, a family fracture not by death or disaster, but by a choice forced too early. Still, James adapted. He became more responsible than most kids his age. Watching his mother struggle and endure later health issues, including a terrifying battle with breast cancer, he stepped up in a way many grown adults wouldn't. Through the darkest nights, he stayed by Nicola's side, reminding her of hope with his quiet resilience. James's life hadn't been perfect, but it had been filled with love and a strength that many never noticed until it was too late. As James entered his teenage years, the innocence of childhood slowly gave way to quiet solitude. He wasn't the kind of teen who went to wild parties or courted popularity in the crowded hallways of Seminole Ridge Community High School. Instead, James found comfort in the digital world. Video games became his escape, his creative outlet, and sometimes his only companion. For someone as gentle and reserved as James, these games provided a world where he could be anyone, brave, bold, or adventurous. It was also a space where he didn't feel judged or misunderstood. And in that virtual realm, he met someone who would change his life, a girl named Melanie. Melanie was different, quiet like James, introverted, almost whisper-soft in her presence. Her voice barely carried, her words often swallowed by silence. Her Cambodian heritage shaped her quiet grace, and though shy, she shared something deeply meaningful with James, a love for gaming. What began as casual online conversations soon blossomed into daily messages, playful exchanges, and eventually real-life hangouts. For James, who had never really experienced romantic attention before, Melanie's presence felt like a warm light finally shining into the corners of his world. It didn't take long for their friendship to grow into a romance. Melanie became James's first serious relationship, and her presence brought visible changes in him. He started smiling more, he laughed more freely. Even his family noticed that he stood a little taller when Melanie was around, more at ease in his skin. Nicola, James's mom, welcomed Melanie like one of her own. Melanie spent holidays with the Berries, helped set the dinner table at Thanksgiving, and sat beside James during Christmas gift exchanges. She wasn't just a girlfriend, she had been accepted into the Berry home as family. To Alexandra and others close to James, it seemed like he had found someone who truly understood him. And maybe in the beginning, that was true. But even then, there were small, almost imperceptible shifts in the atmosphere. Moments when Melanie seemed overly attached, when she lingered a little too close, or asked questions that hinted at possessiveness. But James, ever the peacemaker, ignored those signs. This was love, after all, his first. And like many young hearts discovering love for the first time, he believed it could conquer anything. But love, as James would tragically learn, is only beautiful when it's healthy. And Melanie's affection was not just intense, it was consuming. By 2016, James Berry seemed to be finding his rhythm in life. He had graduated from high school and enrolled at Palm Beach State College, steadily working toward a future that promised stability, purpose, and peace. He was living in Loxahatchee, Florida, a quieter area surrounded by nature, animals, and the familiar comforts he always held close. He had a part-time job, kept his circle small, and most importantly, he was surrounded by the people he loved. His mother Nicola, her partner Guy, his best friend Jeff, and yes, Melanie, who had re-entered his life once again. Despite a painful breakup that followed a deeply disturbing incident, Melanie poisoned James's prized saltwater fish tank during an argument. Somehow, they had reconciled. James had given her another chance. Whether out of love, guilt, or the hopeful belief that people could change, no one could really say. But Alexandra, James's sister, remembered being shocked when she heard they were back together. She couldn't understand how her sweet, gentle brother, someone so deeply hurt by that act, could let Melanie back in. But James, as always, had been forgiving. Too forgiving. Then came November 16, 2016, a night that began like many others. The Berry family was preparing for dinner. James was home, Melanie had been invited over, and the atmosphere was relaxed and joyful. They ate together, shared stories, and laughed around the dinner table. For a family that had been through so much, these were the moments they cherished, Simple, quiet, peaceful. There was no warning, no tension in the air. It was just an ordinary night. But ordinary nights can sometimes end in extraordinary tragedy. Just hours later, in the early darkness of 12:52 a.m. on November 17th, a frantic call pierced the silence. Nicola's voice trembled through the 911 line, panic and disbelief laced in every word. Her son, her baby, was lying on the floor, covered in blood. He's bleeding, she cried over and over. The dispatcher tried to calm her, but Nicola's cries said it all. Something horrific had happened, and no one could understand how. Moments later, paramedics were dispatched. What they would walk into was unlike anything they had seen before. What had been a warm home just hours earlier was now a crime scene soaked in grief and blood. And in the center of it all lay James. Lifeless, broken, and gone far too soon. When first responders arrived at the Berry residence, they were not prepared for what awaited them. The porch light cast a dull glow on the blood-stained concrete at the entrance. The front door was wide open, and the smell of iron in the air was unmistakable. As paramedics stepped inside, their boots slid against a crimson path stretching from the doorway through the hall. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, pooling on the floors, smeared as if a struggle had unfolded inch by inch across the home. It looked like a war zone, the kind of scene that leaves an imprint on your soul. Inside James's bedroom, time seemed to stand still. On the floor lay James Berry, unresponsive and battered, his pale skin marred with wounds from what appeared to be a violent stabbing. Next to him, Nicola sobbed, her hands soaked in her son's blood as she desperately tried to stop the bleeding. Guy, her boyfriend, was kneeling beside her, attempting chest compressions. Jeff, James's best friend, stood nearby, stunned and shaking, barely able to process what he was witnessing. But no amount of love or effort could undo what had already been done. James was gone. 21 years old, and murdered in the very place he should have felt safest, his home. Police were called to the scene almost immediately. As they arrived, their first priority was to preserve the scene and separate potential witnesses. They knew from the blood patterns, from the brutality of the wounds, that this was not an accident or a suicide. Someone had attacked James with intent. But who and why? As the investigation began, the detectives found a crucial piece of evidence sitting in plain sight on the kitchen counter, a long, curved knife with a sharpened edge. The blade was clean, but not spotless. It didn't belong there, and it certainly hadn't been used for dinner. This, they believed, was the murder weapon. But that raised more questions than answers. How had it ended up in the kitchen, far from where James was found? Was it moved after the attack? Was someone trying to cover something up? With no forced entry, no signs of burglary, and all signs pointing inward, the investigators turned their attention to those inside the home. One of them, they feared, might be hiding a terrible truth. The Berry family, shattered by grief, would now have to answer difficult questions, because in the immediate aftermath of a murder, everyone is a suspect. Detectives at the scene quickly began piecing together the fragments of the night. With no signs of forced entry and the murder weapon sitting in plain view, their focus naturally shifted inward, toward the people inside the home. In a situation this raw, this violent, it was impossible to overlook the fact that James's killer may have been one of the last to see him alive. Everyone present was now both a grieving witness and a possible suspect. That includes his best friend Jeff, his mother Nicola, and her partner Guy. Jeff was the first to be questioned. He had known James since they were kids, and the two were practically inseparable. In recent years, Jeff had moved in with James, turning their bond into a comfortable roommate dynamic. Sitting down with detectives, Jeff's voice was hoarse and shaky. He recalled that after dinner, everything had seemed normal. James had been gaming, as he often did, while Jeff went to bed around 10 p.m. But then came a moment, quiet and strange, where James woke Jeff and murmured something cryptic. "I think it's over." Jeff, half asleep, had no idea what James meant. He waved him off, telling him to rest. The next time Jeff saw James, he was bleeding on the floor, unrecognizable and fading fast. But Jeff mentioned something else, something that raised flags. He told police that he'd seen the knife, the possible murder weapon, lying on the bedroom floor near James's body when he arrived at the scene. Yet when officers got there, the knife was in the kitchen. How did it move? Who touched it? Was the crime scene altered, intentionally or not? That mystery was cleared up, at least partially, when Nicola's boyfriend, Guy, offered an explanation. Through choked words and trembling hands, he confessed that he had picked up the knife and moved it. He wasn't thinking straight, none of them were. He said he saw the blade lying there and panicked, afraid someone might step on it amidst the chaos. So he carried it to the kitchen counter, then rushed back to help James. It wasn't the smartest move, that it wasn't premeditated either. It was the reaction of a man caught in an unfolding nightmare. Still, police had to be cautious. Guy's actions, even well-intentioned, meant the scene had been tampered with. The truth was getting harder to pin down. And then, outside on the porch, detectives spotted something that would complicate everything further. A phone with a pink case, sitting alone. And it didn't belong to Nicola. As officers surveyed the scene, eyes sharp for any clue, one item stopped them: a lone phone sitting on a porch table. Its case was pink, dainty, and clearly not Nicola's. In the chaos of the emergency, no one had claimed it. Investigators stared at the device, uncertain what it meant, until headlights appeared at the edge of the driveway, sweeping across the yard. A car door opened. A woman stepped out, anxiety written across her face. She was around Nicola's age, and she approached the officers with urgency in her voice. "I'm looking for my daughter," she said. "She was supposed to be here tonight. Her name's Melanie." Suddenly, everything shifted. Melanie. The name instantly triggered alarm bells. The same Melanie who had been James's girlfriend. The same Melanie who had attended the family dinner just hours earlier. The pink phone, it was hers. But where was she now? Why would she leave her phone behind? And most disturbingly, why hadn't anyone seen her since the attack? Police turned to Nicola, Jeff, and Guy and asked the question everyone was now thinking. Was Melanie still in the house when James was killed? Or had she disappeared into the night before the 911 call? The trio confirmed that Melanie had been invited to dinner, but at some point, no one was quite sure when, she had vanished. Now, Melanie wasn't just James's ex-girlfriend, she was a missing person, and perhaps more. Detectives dug deeper. They circled back to Jeff, whose unique position as James's roommate gave him a front-row seat to the relationship. Jeff had always been supportive of James, but he confessed something that painted Melanie in a far darker light. According to him, Melanie had shown signs of obsession from the very beginning. She was clingy, jealous, and easily upset. She hated when James went places without her, accused him of hiding things, and even followed him when she felt left out. She guilt-tripped him into taking her everywhere, even places she wasn't invited. Jeff had warned James countless times that this wasn't healthy. But James, blinded by love and perhaps loneliness, didn't listen. And then Jeff revealed a chilling detail. During one of their many fights, Melanie had poisoned James's beloved saltwater fish tank, killing every one of his exotic fish. It wasn't just petty, it was cruel, cold, calculated. And after that horrifying act, James finally broke up with her. But Melanie didn't take no for an answer. She had vowed more than once that if she couldn't have James, no one could. Melanie Abe's relationship with James had never truly ended, not in her mind at least. Even after James broke up with her, after the horrifying incident with the poisoned fish tank, Melanie didn't walk away. In fact, her behavior only escalated. She clung to hope in a way that wasn't romantic. It was obsessive. She sent long messages, made late-night calls, and threatened to harm herself if James didn't take her back. Her love had crossed into possession. She wasn't trying to move on. She was trying to regain control. Even her family saw the warning signs. To create some distance, they sent Melanie to Maryland for a while, hoping the separation would cool her emotions and break the unhealthy cycle. And for a while, it seemed to work.
James appeared lighter, freer. He refocused on school, on his life, on healing. But just when everyone thought it was over, James dropped a bombshell. He and Melanie were back together. Alexandra remembered the moment she heard the news. Her heart sank. She couldn't understand how her gentle brother could return to someone who had hurt him so deeply. But James had always been forgiving, too forgiving. He believed people could change. Maybe Melanie had convinced him she had changed too. Maybe, for a moment, he believed they could rebuild something better. But it was a false hope. By November 2016, the cracks in their relationship had returned, and this time they were deeper. The control, the tension, the emotional blackmail, they hadn't disappeared. Then came the breaking point. On the night of November 16th, just hours before his death, James had finally had enough. He messaged his father, James Sr., saying that he planned to end things with Melanie for good. His father responded with love and support, but even he couldn't have imagined what would come next. The final piece of evidence came from a gaming app James used regularly. In the messages, there it was. James had officially broken up with Melanie that night. The tone was respectful but firm. He had made his decision. And Melanie's response? Angry, hurt, furious. The kind of fury that doesn't just simmer, it explodes. Detectives now knew they weren't just looking for a missing girlfriend. They were hunting someone driven by obsession, rage, and rejection. And the longer Melanie was gone, the more dangerous she became.
With Melanie's pink phone now in evidence and her sudden disappearance raising every red flag imaginable, investigators turned their attention to finding her. James was dead. The breakup was confirmed. Melanie had been at the scene, and now she was gone. It didn't take long before the theory became clear. She wasn't missing, she was running. The search for Melanie escalated fast. Officers began canvassing the area around the Barry home. Neighbors were questioned, street cameras reviewed, and tips flooded in. Then a major break came in the form of CCTV footage. One neighbor's camera, pointed toward the road, had captured a white Toyota pulling up in front of the Barry home shortly before the murder. Then, minutes after the time of death, the same white car was seen speeding away. The vehicle was quickly identified as Melanie's. Now, not only was she the prime suspect, but the evidence was beginning to confirm it. A BOLO, be on the lookout, was issued statewide. Police knew that if they didn't act fast, she could cross state lines. But before long, they got another lead. Witnesses reported seeing a white Toyota at Turnpike Plaza, nearly an hour after the time of the murder. Surveillance confirmed the car's presence. Melanie had clearly been on the move, and law enforcement feared she was headed to the only other place that made sense, Maryland, where her extended family lived. Then came the confirmation. Melanie's credit card had been used in Maryland. They had her location. The hunt was narrowing in. But even with all the evidence pointing in one direction, the police needed more than location. They needed a confession. Without it, her defense could argue reasonable doubt. She could claim someone else had done it. And though the physical evidence was mounting, it was still largely circumstantial. A confession would make the case airtight. So a plan was formed. Florida detectives coordinated with Maryland police to approach Melanie, not as officers chasing a fugitive, but as calm, neutral investigators wanting to ask a few questions. The approach was strategic. They didn't want to spook her into running again. They needed her calm. They needed her to talk. When they finally arrived at her cousin's home, Melanie's car was parked in the driveway. She was there. The moment had come. What happened next was as bizarre as it was revealing. Detectives approached the home in Maryland with a delicate strategy. They weren't there to arrest Melanie. Not yet. The plan was to keep her calm, unthreatened, and talking. If they could get a confession voluntarily, it would be the cornerstone of their case. When they knocked on the door, Melanie's cousin answered. The detectives explained that they were looking to speak with Melanie about an incident back in Florida. A few minutes later, she appeared. Melanie walked out slowly, her posture stiff, her hands fidgeting nervously. She looked small, withdrawn, and strangely unprepared. But then she said something that threw the detectives off completely. "I'm just wondering when I should go in for questioning."
They hadn't mentioned James. They hadn't told her why they were there. And yet, she seemed to know exactly what this was about. Alarm bells rang silently. Melanie was already tripping over herself, anticipating questions, trying to manage the narrative before they'd even asked it. Then came another revealing line. "Do I need a lawyer?" The Florida detectives took over the next day. They met Melanie in her cousin's home under the pretense of gathering her side of the story. No threats, no accusations, just soft questions, carefully worded. The detectives were skilled. They guided her gently through each moment of that night, avoiding pressure or confrontation. And it worked. Melanie began to talk. First about her emotions, about how upset she was when James broke up with her over the gaming app. Then about how she'd cried for hours. But the sadness didn't last. It turned to rage. Rejection, to her, felt unbearable. And that night, she got in her car and drove to James's house to talk. According to Melanie, when she confronted James, he told her flatly that he didn't love her anymore. That was the moment everything snapped. She claimed she acted out of impulse. She described reaching into the kitchen drawer, pulling out a knife, and attacking him. The scene unfolded in bursts: rage, movement, struggle. The fight moved from the kitchen to the hallway, then into James's bedroom. And then, silence. James was gone. Without prompting, Melanie even gave police the clothes she'd worn that night. She wasn't under arrest. She wasn't even told to do so. But she surrendered them anyway. Blood-spattered and damning, they were now evidence. It was stunning. She had fled across state lines, abandoned her phone, tried to disappear. But now, face to face with investigators, Melanie had confessed to it all. By the morning of November 18, 2016, everything had changed. With a full confession in hand, physical evidence linking her to the crime, and eyewitness accounts confirming her presence that night, investigators were ready to move. Melanie Ashibe was arrested at 8:30 a.m. for the second-degree murder of her ex-boyfriend, James Barry. She didn't resist. In fact, she appeared strangely calm, as if a weight had been lifted. But the damage had already been done. A kind, gentle young man had been brutally killed, and now the long and painful road to justice had officially begun. Melanie was extradited from Maryland to Florida. Her arrival at the local detention center marked the beginning of a case that would not only test the legal system, but also the strength and patience of the Barry family. James's parents, Nicola and James Sr., and his sister Alexandra were thrust into a process that no family should ever have to endure. Reliving their trauma in a courtroom, watching the person responsible for their son's death plead her case, and hoping the truth would prevail. But before the trial could begin, Melanie's defense team filed a pretrial motion, a move that threatened to unravel the case entirely. They argued that Melanie's confession was coerced, that she had requested an attorney multiple times, and that police had ignored her constitutional rights. If the confession was thrown out, it would gut the prosecution's strongest piece of evidence. The prosecution, however, stood firm. Melanie had not been under arrest when she confessed. She was in her cousin's home, not an interrogation room. She had not been read her Miranda rights because she was never detained. She volunteered the information freely. She even handed over her clothing without being asked. The prosecutors called the motion a desperate attempt to derail a solid case. Weeks passed as the judge reviewed the motion. For the Barry family, it was excruciating. The possibility that Melanie could walk free, despite her confession, was unbearable. But in the end, the judge ruled in the state's favor. The confession would stand. It was a victory, but a small one. A legal system was slow. Trial dates were pushed, documents reviewed endlessly. The wheels of justice were turning, but not nearly fast enough for a grieving family desperate for closure. And yet, the hardest part was still ahead: the trial, where the truth would be dissected, challenged, and put on display for all to see. It took almost 2 years for the case of James Barry's murder to finally reach trial. For the Barry family, those years were filled with agony, grief that never faded, public speculation, and the endless wait for justice. By the time 2018 arrived, emotions were raw, but resolve was firm. The prosecution was ready. The courtroom filled with reporters, family members, and community members who had followed the tragic case from the start. At the center of it all sat Melanie Ashibe, calm, quiet, almost ghost-like, charged with ending the life of the man he claimed to love. The prosecution's case was direct, methodical, and emotionally powerful. They painted Melanie as a young woman consumed by obsession, someone who couldn't accept rejection and responded with violence. They detailed her history of controlling behavior, her jealousy, and her manipulation. They told the jury about the poisoned aquarium, the obsessive texts, and how Melanie had driven to James's home with a single purpose in mind: to make sure if she couldn't have James, no one else could either. They presented her confession, the knife, the clothes she surrendered voluntarily, and the surveillance footage showing her white Toyota speeding away after the murder. It was a puzzle that, when assembled, left no gaps. Melanie had admitted it. She had committed the murder. It should have been simple. But the defense pushed back hard. They claimed Melanie's confession was misleading, made under emotional duress, and lacked proper legal safeguards. They painted her as a troubled but remorseful young woman, someone overwhelmed by heartbreak, not a cold-blooded killer. But most shocking of all, they tried to shift suspicion. In a stunning twist, the defense accused Guy Hand and Nicola Barry of being responsible for James's death. They argued that Guy, who had moved the knife, was tampering with evidence. They suggested Nicola, James's own mother, was covering something up. It was outrageous, painful, and cruel, but it planted a seed of doubt. For 2 days, the jury deliberated. Inside the courtroom, silence reigned. The Barry family waited, breath held, eyes on the door. But when the verdict came, it didn't bring resolution. The jury was hung, unable to reach a unanimous decision. Shock rippled through the courtroom. The trial had ended without a verdict. James's killer had confessed, but justice had slipped through the cracks. The prosecution, determined not to fail the family again, announced a second trial. They would not give up. They owed James that much. The failed first trial left the Barry family shattered all over again. It was a cruel echo of the night they lost James, a painful reminder that justice, like peace, doesn't come easy. Even with a confession, even with evidence, a jury had failed to agree. But the prosecution refused to back down. Within weeks, the state of Florida announced a second trial would be held. This time, they would fight even harder. No distractions, no loopholes, no doubts. In September 2018, Melanie Abe once again took her place in the courtroom, this time knowing that she wouldn't get another shot at leniency. The second trial was faster, more focused, and more emotionally charged than the first. The prosecution had learned from the mistakes of the past. They streamlined their case, honing in on Melanie's obsessive behavior, her manipulation, and the cold, calculated way she had planned and carried out the murder. They reminded the jury that Melanie had driven to James's house that night with one goal: confrontation. That she had picked up the knife herself. That James was found with multiple stab wounds, indicating rage, not self-defense. They emphasized the confession, given freely, without pressure, while Melanie was sitting in her cousin's home, not under arrest. She had even volunteered her bloody clothes. These were not the actions of a confused, grieving ex. These were the actions of someone who had something to hide until she couldn't anymore. The defense tried once again to humanize Melanie, casting her as emotionally unstable and mentally overwhelmed. But the tactic fell flat. The jury had heard it all before, and the facts this time stood firm. Melanie's actions weren't a mistake, they were a decision. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated again. This time, they didn't need days. Within hours, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Melanie Abe was sentenced to 50 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed. She showed little emotion as the verdict was read, but in the courtroom, James's family broke down. It wasn't joy, it was sorrow. Sorrow that justice had finally come, but James was still gone. For Alexandra, for Nicola, for James Sr., this was the moment they'd waited for. The legal battle was over. The nightmare would never fully end, but now, at least, there was accountability. Melanie had taken James's life, now her own life would be spent behind bars. The gavel had fallen, the verdict was in. Melanie Abe was going to prison for 50 years. But while the courtroom had delivered justice, the pain didn't leave with her. For the Barry family, there would be no victory in this tragedy, only survival. The sentence could not bring James back. It could not erase the images burned into their memories or restore the fractured sense of peace that had once filled their home. The wound was still raw, and always would be. James Barry was more than a victim. He was a son, a brother, a friend, a kind-hearted young man who had never asked for anything but love and understanding. In the months following the verdict, the Barry household remained quiet, heavy with grief. Nicola struggled with guilt and trauma. She'd tried to save her son, knelt beside him, screamed into the phone for help. She relived it nightly. James Sr., though long separated from Nicola, was devastated too. He carried the weight of their last conversation, the one where James promised to finally end things with Melanie. And then there was Alexandra. For Alexandra, the pain was layered. She'd lost not only her younger brother, but her best friend, the one who shared her love of games and animals, who made her laugh with his shy but sweet nature. The boy she'd grown up chasing frogs with was now gone forever, and the person responsible had once sat at their dinner table. The betrayal cut just as deep as the loss. Worse still was the accusation that Nicola and her partner Guy had been part of the crime. That defense strategy had wounded them all over again. The courtroom had cleared them, but the mere suggestion had left scars. It had taken everything from them just to survive that night, and now they had to live with the shame of having their love for James twisted into suspicion. In the months following the trial, Alexandra spoke out publicly. She talked about James, who he really was. Not just a name in the news, but a young man with dreams, kindness, and a deep love for life. She spoke about Melanie, not with hate, but with clarity. Rejection hurts, she said, but it is never a reason to destroy someone. She began working with local organizations, speaking to schools about emotional abuse and the warning signs of obsession. Her goal, to make sure that no one else suffers the way her family did. James Barry's story is a painful reminder of how fleeting and fragile life can be. It only took a moment, a single decision, for everything to be ripped apart. His death was sudden, senseless, and cruel. But through the devastation, those who loved him have fought to ensure his memory doesn't fade into silence. James was not defined by the way he died. He was defined by the way he lived, with quiet kindness, deep loyalty, and a heart that never turned away from anyone. He was the boy who played video games late into the night, who loved animals like family, who stuck by people even when they didn't deserve it. He believed in love, in second chances, in the good in people. It was that goodness that ultimately made him vulnerable, and that vulnerability was exploited in the most tragic way. His story sparked important conversations about mental health, about emotional manipulation, about obsession disguised as love. Alexandra, James's sister, has taken it upon herself to make those conversations public. She's given talks, written articles, and connected with other families who've suffered similar losses. In every word she speaks, James lives on. He is not a cautionary tale. He is a reason to change, to protect others from the same fate. The Barry family has also pushed for reforms, urging schools and communities to recognize the warning signs of controlling relationships, even in teens and young adults. They've advocated for more resources for young people struggling with breakups, for counseling programs, and education that emphasizes emotional boundaries and healthy attachment. Melanie Abe remains in prison, sentenced to 50 years for a crime fueled by jealousy, rejection, and an inability to let go. Her name may remain in case files, but in the hearts of those who knew James, she is irrelevant now. The focus is no longer on how she died, but on how she lived. Every Christmas, Nicola lights a candle at the table where James once sat. Alexandra keeps a photo of her brother by her bedside. James Sr. visits the animal shelter in James's name. They keep going, not because it gets easier, but because James deserves a legacy that outshines the violence that stole him. This was never just a murder case. It was a story about love gone wrong, about trust shattered, and about the enduring strength of a family that refuses to forget. James Barry was loved deeply, and now remembered always.